Imagine stepping into a delivery room, but, well, instead of hospital monitors and sterile lights, you see a wooden cross, Roman guards, and a violent public execution.
Yeah, that is quite the visual.
Right. And if you're listening to this, you're probably thinking what I was thinking when I first read our source material for today. Like, how on earth does a violent execution translate to childbirth? So welcome back to another deep dive. Today, we have a mission that is going to take you into an interpretive landscape that absolutely shatters the familiar, categorized ways we usually read ancient manuscripts.
Yeah.
We're looking at a highly unconventional, really mind-bending paper titled Jesus Redesigns Embryology by an author listed simply as a author.
Yeah, and before we go any further, it is critical that we set the framework and the ground rules for the material we are exploring today. The source text relies entirely on Christian scriptures and deeply religious concepts. However, as a show, we are taking an entirely neutral, impartial stance here. We are not endorsing these views as theological truth, nor are we taking any religious sides. Our purpose is purely analytical. We are examining the author's unique literary and conceptual framework, a structural thought experiment that maps ancient scripture directly onto the biological realities of human embryology.
Exactly. That is the core premise of this paper, and it is a wild one. The author is essentially asking, what if the entirety of the Gospels, like the narrative from start to finish, is actually a massive, complex blueprint for fetal development in the womb? Like, what if every miracle, every character interaction is a biological metaphor? Okay, let's unpack this.
Well, to truly grasp the scale of the author's argument, we actually have to invert our normal chronological thinking and start at the end of the traditional story.
Wait, start at the end.
Yeah, because in the science of embryology, the end of the gestation period is the beginning of life.
Right.
The culmination of the entire pregnancy process is the birth. So the author bypasses Bethlehem entirely and takes us straight to the crucifixion.
Which completely stalled my brain at first, I have to admit. You are taking a tomb, the ultimate historical and literary symbol of an ending, of absolute finality, and trying to turn it into a delivery room, the ultimate symbol of a beginning. From a purely mechanical standpoint, how does the author justify flipping the cessation of biological function into the start of one?
The author does it by aggressively focusing on the physical realities described in the text, treating them as anatomical clues. Think about the physical posture of a crucifixion. The body is forced into a highly constricted, curled, and bound position for an extended period, unable to move freely.
Oh, like a baby in a womb.
Exactly. The paper argues that this mirrors the fetal position of a fully grown infant restricted in the tight space of the womb right before birth, unable to breathe independently. But the linchpin of the argument rests on specific scriptural references acting as architectural pillars. The paper points to Matthew 27.51, Mark 15.38, and Luke 23.45.
Right, those are the verses describing the exact moment Jesus surrenders his last breath. He delivers himself to the Father, and at that precise second, the curtain of the temple is torn in two. I mean, I've always heard that explained philosophically as a metaphor for the separation between humanity and the divine being removed.
Yeah, that is the traditional theological reading, yes. But in this biological framework, the text is interpreted as literal, gritty biology. The tearing of the curtain is the amniotic sac tearing.
Wow.
It is the water breaking. It signals the immediate, unavoidable transition from the internal gestating environment into the external world.
So the water breaking is literal here. And the author maps the people present at the scene perfectly to a birth, too. You have Joseph, specifically Joseph of Arimathea, who takes the body, acting as the father figure from beyond the curtain, pulling the child into the outside world.
Right, and the women at the burial scene.
Yeah, they aren't just mourners in this reading. The author casts them as midwives. They take the body, wash it, and wrap it tightly in linens, which perfectly mirrors the swaddling of a newborn infant.
It does. And the textual mapping goes even further. The paper addresses the people mocking Jesus at the cross, referred to in the text, as the people of this generation. The author suggests a fascinating auditory metaphor here. While Jesus was inside the metaphorical womb, he could hear the muffled, distorted voices of the people outside.
Oh, like a fetus hearing through the belly.
Precisely. By dying to that enclosed world, he leaves the womb to be resurrected. And resurrection, in this strictly biological context, means being born into the physical world, in the flesh, where those same voices that affected him through the uterine wall now interact with him face to face.
Wow. That makes sense in this framework.
What's fascinating here is how radically this reframes the concept of trauma within the text. We are conditioned by centuries of art and literature to view the crucifixion as a punitive, agonizing end. But by placing it within the framework of embryology, the author transforms a violent execution into a developmental necessity.
Yeah, the trauma is no longer a punishment inflicted by authorities.
Exactly. It is the forceful, unavoidable physical trauma of childbirth. Dying to one environment is the prerequisite for being born into another.
It really forces you to completely rethink the visual language of the story. The narrative is no longer about ending a life, but about surviving the passage of birth.
Right.
But if that violent conclusion is actually the birth, then we have to rewind the clock all the way back to see how this blueprint handles conception. Like, how does the paper frame the very beginning of the biological process?
That takes us directly to the Annunciation, found in Luke 1:26-38. This is the moment the angel Gabriel visits Mary to announce she will bear a child.
Right. And this is where the author strips away all the soft-focus mysticism. You usually picture this scene with golden halos, hovering angels, and a choir in the background. But the author treats it like a microscopic, high-definition documentary of conception. Gabriel delivering the news isn't a celestial messenger. Gabriel is the physical delivery vector, introducing the father's genetic material to the mother's seed.
The author points to the specific language used in the Gospel of Luke to support this. Gabriel tells Mary, "The Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you." Rather than reading this as spiritual poetry about divine intervention, the author reads it as a literal, mechanical description of biological fertilization.
The exact moment the external genetic material merges with the internal egg.
Yes.
And Mary's famous response, "Let it be with me according to your word," is recast entirely. It's no longer a statement of theological obedience. The author views this as the biological submission of the woman's seed. It is the cellular membrane of the egg accepting the sperm, allowing the transformation of her seed to begin.
It turns an ethereal moment into a gritty, cellular reality. Two tiny biological components colliding in the dark.
It really does.
The paper actually argues that the text gives us a detailed account of the sperm's journey prior to that collision. The author points to Mary's song of praise, known as the Magnificat, which occurs a few verses later. Traditionally, this is a hymn of spiritual joy and societal upheaval. The author, however, recontextualizes this song as a microscopic retrospective.
I have to admit, I struggled with that leap. Framing a beautiful hymn about casting down the mighty as a microscopic obstacle course. Isn't that stretching the metaphor to the breaking point?
It sounds like a stretch until you look at how the author maps the specific words. The song talks about scattering the proud, bringing down the powerful, and facing great perils. The author equates this to the perilous, microscopically violent journey of millions of sperm traveling toward the egg.
Because the biological environment of the reproductive tract is incredibly hostile.
Exactly. Millions of cells fail. They are scattered and brought down until against all odds that one single triumphant seed survives to reach the destination. The song is the victor's tale of that cellular journey.
Man, it takes something considered incredibly holy and grounds it in the absolute mud and reality of human reproduction. So, fertilization happens. But there's a massive temporal gap in human biology before we see any real external development. Biology demands a waiting period to confirm viability. So how does the author map the early stages of pregnancy onto the biblical timeline?
By seizing on a very specific, easily overlooked detail in the text. Right after the Annunciation, the Gospel states that Mary travels to stay with her relative Elizabeth for exactly 3 months.
A full trimester.
Yes. The author offers a starkly grounded interpretation of this 3-month period. It isn't just a casual family visit or a narrative device to get two characters in the same room. It signifies the practical, biological waiting period required in the ancient world to confirm a viable pregnancy.
That makes perfect sense when you think about the historical context. I mean, they didn't have over-the-counter tests. The only way to know if a pregnancy had taken hold was to wait out the biological cycles.
Right. The author specifically notes this 3-month stay as the legal and practical waiting period related to the absence of period blood. It's the time needed to be absolutely certain that the seed has taken hold, that miscarriage hasn't occurred, and that the gestation is officially underway.
Which is just fascinating.
This raises an important question, though. If you're a listener absorbing this, you have to wonder about the author's intent. Why take a text that is so heavily insulated by high theology, kept so safely in the realm of the purely spiritual, and forcefully blend it with such grounded, starkly human biological realities, like missing periods, cellular membranes, the tearing of an amniotic sac?
Well, the structural logic suggests the author is trying to create the ultimate shared human denominator. By mapping the divine story onto the blueprint of embryology, it makes the divine story profoundly visceral for the listener. It takes a narrative that can feel distant, ancient, or untouchable and locks it into an experience that is universally human.
Every single person listening to this show is the result of this exact biological process.
Right. By grounding the mysticism in blood, weighting, and cellular growth, it forces the reader to engage with the text on a bodily level. It changes the story from something you merely believe in to something you have physically survived. All right, so the pregnancy is confirmed, the first trimester is over. Now the fetus actually has to grow and build its internal systems. Here's where it gets really interesting, because how does the author map the years of active public ministry, all the walking around, the preaching, the crowds, and specifically the miracles?
The author argues that the entirety of the earthly ministry, specifically the physical healings, represents the developmental milestones of a growing fetus inside the womb. Every miracle is a new biological system coming online.
Wait, hold on. I need to push back on this because the mechanics seem flawed. Fetal eyes develop in pitch darkness inside the womb. They aren't blind and needing to be cured of a disease, they're just forming. How does the author equate a miraculous healing of a sick person with normal, healthy fetal development?
That's a fair point, but the author isn't suggesting the fetus is diseased. The argument is that the textual healing of an ailment is a literary metaphor for the biological activation of a dormant capability.
Oh, I see.
Think about it. A fetus begins its existence without the capacity to see, hear, speak, or taste, or move its limbs. In that restricted environment, it is, by definition, blind, deaf, mute, and immobile. So when Jesus heals the blind man in the narrative, the author reads that as the exact moment the fetal eyes develop the anatomical capacity for sight, even in the dark.
Ah, okay. So the healing of the deaf represents the auditory system fully connecting, allowing the fetus to finally hear those muffled voices from outside we talked about earlier. Healing the mute is the development of the vocal cords. Healing the lame represents the moment the nervous system fires and the fetus begins to kick and move its limbs.
Precisely.
It's like reading one of those modern pregnancy tracking apps, this week your baby can hear. But the author has mapped those medical push notifications onto ancient stories of miraculous healings.
It's a brilliant comparative structure that seamlessly integrates the environment of the womb into the narrative. Take the miracle of turning water into wine, for example.
Wait, how does turning water into wine fit into, fetal development?
Well, in this embryological framework, the water turning into wine represents the development of the sense of taste and the changing composition of the uterine environment. The amniotic fluid, which begins essentially as water, suddenly takes on complex flavor profiles based on the mother's diet as the fetal taste buds become active.
So the environment becomes rich and complex.
Exactly. And then the author tackles the ultimate miracle, the raising of Lazarus from the dead.
Which would have to be the biggest biological milestone of all, right?
Precisely. The author interprets the raising of Lazarus not as an end-of-life resuscitation, but as the ultimate transition from non-life to life. It represents the spark of viability, the critical threshold where the fetus moves from being a mere collection of developing cells to a genuinely living, animated organism capable of sustaining life.
That drastically changes the tone of the Gospels. It centralizes all of human ailment. Every sickness, every disability mentioned in the text is gathered up into a single universal experience that every sensible person reading the text has gone through the process of growing inside the womb.
It reframes the miracles completely. They're no longer suspensions of natural law. They are the flawless execution of natural law.
But to hit those developmental milestones, a fetus requires continuous, unrelenting fuel. It can't grow in isolation. Where does the author find the mechanism for nourishment in this ancient text? This brings us to the final, perhaps most surreal analogy in the source, the Eucharist, and the feeding of the multitude.
Right. This is where the author's metaphor expands from the mechanics of an individual body to the mechanics of a massive collective. The author looks at the established concept of the mystical body of Christ and frames this entire massive body as a single developing fetus.
So we aren't just talking about Jesus, the individual character, anymore. We are talking about the entire organism of his followers acting as the cellular makeup of this fetus.
Correct. And the author uses the story of feeding the multitude, the crowd waiting in a single line to receive their daily spiritual bread, to represent the individual body parts of the fetus at the end of the umbilical cord.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, receiving nutrients one by one.
Think of it less like a bakery handing out bread to a random crowd, and more like a central server distributing critical data packets to individual nodes on a vast network. Each cell, each node, relies entirely on that single central pipeline to receive what it needs to function and build the whole picture.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it completely shifts the idea of what communion is. It takes a group of separate individuals standing in a field or a church and binds them together as an absolutely dependent, unified organism,
Yeah, they aren't a crowd, they are limbs and organs growing together.
sustained by a single umbilical lifeline.
So, what does this all mean? Let's take a breath and look at the sheer scale of the architecture we've unpacked today. The author of this paper took one of the most familiar ancient stories in human history and perfectly placed it over the blueprint of human gestation.
We moved from the fertilization of the Annunciation through the necessary 3-month waiting period of the first trimester. We tracked the miracles as fetal milestones and observed the delivery of cellular nourishment through the umbilical cord of the multitude.
All of it inevitably leading to the water breaking of the crucifixion. Again, just to reiterate our stance here, we are not suggesting this is the traditional or orthodox way to read these ancient texts. It is a completely non-traditional and metaphorical way to read the text, but it's a brilliant exercise in finding new patterns in old information.
It is. And analyzing this framework leaves us with a rather profound final thought to ponder that builds on the text. If we adopt the author's logic, if an entire lifetime of earthly ministry, of suffering and death, is merely the gestation period before being truly born, what does that imply about how we view our own lives?
That is a heavy question.
Are we all right now just sitting in, another kind of womb? Are we merely experiencing our own developmental miracles and ailments in this life, waiting for our own water to break into whatever massive, unimaginable world comes next?
I think we're going to leave you to chew on that entirely new existential crisis. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.